Good morning. Just gonna let attendees get logged in. Good morning, good morning. Welcome to Zoom. We'll get started in about 1 to 1.5 minutes. All right. I will get us started for this morning. Good morning. My name is Emily Hegarty. I'm the program director here at the Napa Valley Grape Growers and the Napa Valley Farmworker Foundation. And welcome to our second Business of Vineyards, focusing on vineyard values and trends. I'd like to start by thanking the annual sponsors that you see on the screen here. We are incredibly grateful for partners like them who work towards a common goal of preserving and promoting Napa Valley's world-class vineyards, along with making events like this possible. So thank you so much. Next, we are going to cover a few housekeeping slides. First, after each presenter, we will do a quick question and answer. So anytime you'd like, if a question pops to mind, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom left of your screen. Following the end of all presentations and Q&A, we will do a quick poll at the end of this webinar, which is slightly different than our normal survey. It's only 3 questions, and it is very critical that you fill it out because it allows us to maintain our grant funding from CDFA and USDA. So I will launch that poll at the very end. Answer, 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 and you're done. And finally, a portion of this webinar will have a Spanish interpretation feature. So to access that, what you do is click on the bottom right of your screen, the interpretation button. If you are on a mobile device, it might have 3 little dots that you need to access it. And you are going to select your language, being Spanish, and then you want to mute original audio so that you don't hear the English slightly in the background. And that is it. It's very easy. And if you'd like to listen in Espanol, go ahead and do that right now. So now I am here to welcome our speakers. Today we have a very knowledgeable group, and very entertaining bunch, so I think you're in for a treat. Starting us off, we have John Tudor, who is currently serving his 6th term as Napa County Assessor, Recorder, and County Clerk. John's 42 plus years of county service include County Assessor for 11 years and the 5th District Supervisor for 7. Welcome, John. Following John, you will hear from Tony Correa, who is the principal and owner of the Correa Company and widely recognized as a leading authority on the valuation of vineyards and wineries and other agricultural and rural properties. Welcome, Tony. And finally, we have Robert Nicholson, principal of International Wine Associates, along with Josh Grace as managing director of IWA, joining us. Robert is the leader in New World wine industry mergers and acquisitions, simply by the number of deals he's closed, which is over 2 billion in transactions. Bravo, Robert. And Josh has over 20 years of financial management, valuation, accounting, mergers and acquisitions, and corporate advisory experience with a specialization in the wine industry and liquor industry. So we've got quite a crew. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to let John take it from here. John, I'll get your presentation up.
Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everybody. There are two disclaimers I'd like to make at the beginning of my presentation. The first one is, as county assessor, it's my job to be fair, not to raise money. And I want to make sure that the assessment is correct and that the property is getting the best benefits of property tax incentives that they can have. So no one should pay more property taxes than they should, in my view. And the second thing I want to say is I'm the Napa County assessor. What I'm saying today is our policies in Napa County. Each of us throughout the 58 counties are elected. We are constitutional officers, and we may take slightly different interpretations of what Proposition 19 or how to assess vineyard leases. So I'm speaking from a Napa County perspective. I'm very available to talk to people, not just from Napa County. I get questions from all over the state because I've been around for so long. So feel free, you'll have my contact information in my presentation. Feel free to contact me whether you're in Napa County or not to ask questions, but the final answer will come from your local assessor, not from me. So just briefly, we're going to cover a number of topics related to vineyards. I'm going to leave to Tony, Robert, and Josh what's going on in the market. Assessors, as you know, follow the market. We don't lead the market, and we don't make the market like Josh and Robert do. So my job here is to sort of give you the overview of how we assess vineyards, the special nature of vineyard leases, quick talk about parcels subject to lease and how they're assessed when they change ownership. And finally, the two items that are specific. One is assessment of parcels impacted by our recent fires, which unfortunately were not just in Napa County, but hit a number of counties, and what that did to vineyard valuations. And finally, the family farm provision of Proposition 19. Which a lot of people are interested in. And when I get there, I'll tell you I don't have the answers yet because it's currently being cooked in a big cauldron up in the legislature in Sacramento, and we don't know exactly what the results are going to be, but I'll give you my best guess. So Emily, next slide. So when we're looking at vineyard sales to derive our enrollment of the value for a transaction, we normally take our land values primarily from comparable sales. And you'll be hearing a lot more about comparable sales from the other three panelists. Of course, vineyards are very special. Their location on the valley floor or up in the mountains, or what the soil content is in terms of boron or things like that, make a big influence, but normally the market represents that. So if people are buying in Pope Valley, which may have some boron issues, they should know that if they're knowledgeable buyers, and we would not compare Pope Valley sale with the Rutherford bench sale in the center of the Napa Valley. The non-living improvements, which are your stakes and wires and all of that equipment, your frost protection, your drip irrigation, those are derived primarily from costs, and we take a look on a regular basis, not every year, but we reach out to growers and to those who supply growers and get a best idea of what it costs to put NLI on a parcel that's either being replanted or being planted for the first time. And we pretty much just assign those values on a per acre basis for what it costs to put them in. The vines themselves are exempt for the first 3 years because they're not producing yet, and then they're valued from comparable sales. We do not value, in Napa County, this could be different in other counties, but we put pretty much the same value on every vine, whether it's a Chardonnay or a Gamay or a Cabernet Sauvignon. Those vines can be grafted over, as you know, by T-budding, and so we just take a look essentially at what the vines are worth from a rootstock, and we don't make a distinction between different rootstocks. So it's pretty much X per acre. I think we're in the mid 30,000s an acre now for the vines themselves. And then, of course, unless they're under the Williamson Act, which I'll talk about briefly, the vines get a base year value, just like houses do under Proposition 13, and they increase at 2% a year, just like the NLI do over the course of the time that they're there, if you're being valued under a Proposition 13 base year value. Now, the California Land Conservation Act, also known as the Williamson Act, may provide some benefit in limited cases. About half of our wineries and vineyards that have Williamson Act contracts, their values are actually higher under the Williamson Act restricted value than they are under their Proposition 13 value. So they get the benefit of whichever is lower. But if somebody has recently purchased a vineyard, it often will give them a benefit for a number of years to go into the Williamson Act. One of the big investors and then property owners in the center of the Napa Valley signed a Williamson Act contract when they bought the property, and it protected them for 10 years. But after 10 years, because of their production and the price they were getting for their grapes, they actually flipped to where their original Proposition 13 base year value was lower than their restricted value, which is based on the agricultural income and then is capitalized. So the Williamson Act is something always to consider, especially if you're buying new property in the Napa Valley. You should, with your advisors, take a look at the Williamson Act. Our assessor's office, I'm not sure other counties do this, will do an estimate of your potential savings for a cost of a couple of $100s, and then you can decide whether to apply. The planning department in Napa County handles the application process and sets the rules. In Napa County, you can't get a Williamson Act contract unless the agricultural commissioner tells you and tells the board of supervisors essentially that you have a legitimate agricultural use. If you've got the plans to put a vineyard in and have started that process, that counts. You don't have to have a producing vineyard, but you've either got to have grazing animals if you're on the non-intensive contract, or you need to be in some kind of agricultural production. It could be vegetables, it could be flowers. In parts of San Mateo County has a big flower growing operation. And I can answer questions about the Williamson Act as we go on. Now, the vines themselves, not the land value, I should have said the vine values, are removed during a replant. So just like any other new construction, if you tear down a building, we take the value of that building off the roll. And when you build the new building, it goes back on with a new base year value. The same is true of vines and the NLI. They receive new base year values, and during the time the land is fallow, there is no assessment for the vines and the non-living improvements. So that planting vines is considered new construction, as is putting in stakes and wires and drip irrigation. I'd already mentioned that a vineyard is reassessed upon change of ownership, and at that time is the time when you should think about putting it under a Williamson Act contract if you're paying what are today's high prices for vineyard land. At least for a while, the Williamson Act may protect you until you're in production and you're producing those $20,000 a ton Cabernet Sauvignon grapes. Emily, next slide, please. So we have a lot of vineyards that are leased in Napa Valley and in Napa County, and that may be true throughout the state. If the lessee owns the vines, we actually create a separate assessment for the vines and the non-living improvements, which are assessed directly to the lessee. That is an unsecured assessment, so it doesn't get a two-payment bill. It's a single payment bill, which comes out in July and is due in August. There are a couple of good things about a lessee getting a separate bill. First of all, the landowner or the lessor doesn't have to worry about allocating his bill, which we charge a fee for doing if they ask us to do it, so that the lessor and the lessee have an objective third party doing the allocation. And secondly, for estate planning reasons, and again, I'm not an estate planner, and I think Emily, your group may want to do a seminar on estate planning for vineyard owners, but it is my understanding that if you own a piece of property in the family and you lease the vines and the NLI to a separate entity, it can be a family entity, but let's say John and Emily Jones own the land, but they have an LLC that is separate from them and has separate members in it. It doesn't even have to have separate members. They can be the only members. And they lease their vines and NLI to that separate entity. That removes the value of the vines and the NLI from any estate tax calculations. So that is something just to think of when you're doing estate planning, and make sure that your practitioner agrees with me, because I'm flying a little bit blind here in terms of my not having gone to law school or financial planning school. Now, that still leaves the land to be allocated between the lessor and the lessee. And as long, and I'll talk about that last, as long as the lease is for less than 35 years, there's no reassessment of the land at the time the lease is signed. And it's up to the property owner, the lessor, and the lessee to figure out what percentage of the land taxes that come on the lessor's bill that the lessee will pay. They will be paying directly the vines and the NLI on their unsecured assessment. We want to see the leases. It gives us a good sense of what a fair lease value is, which is important to us for Williamson Act purposes when we're trying to figure out income streams and what we think that a piece of land would lease for, so that we decide what the vineyard land value is worth under the Williamson Act. So, and it also is helpful for us to confirm that the vines and the non-living improvements are owned by the lessee. Those leases remain confidential, and just go into our database. There's no provision for those to be shown to anybody in any form. In my 34 years as assessor, I've never been asked for some idea of lease rates, because that's known in the private industry. And vineyard consultants like Tony and others would be the ones to tell you what land should lease for and what share of crop would be, et cetera. One key thing is that if you're under the Williamson Act as the property owner and you lease out your vines and your non-living improvements to an unsecured assessment to a lessee, that lessee no longer gets the benefit of the Williamson Act contract. The contract runs with the land and the owner, and once the vines and the NLI are owned by the lessee, they are no longer subject to the Williamson Act. We had one case years ago where when the lease was signed, they were existing vines. The jump in the value of the vines was substantial because they'd been under the Williamson Act, and then they were treated under their Prop 13 value when they switched over to the lessee. And those, as I mentioned in the next bullet point, if a lease is assigned, so the lessor leases to A, and then 10 years later, A assigns the lease with the permission of the lessor to B, that's going to trigger a reassessment just of the vines and the non-living improvements. It has nothing to do with the land, assuming the lease is less than 35 years. So, but that would trigger a reassessment when someone else takes over ownerships of the vine and the NLI by assuming the lease. And then finally, for those of you who are thinking of doing a lease, the best idea is to sign a lease of 34 years, 11 months, and 29 days at a maximum, because if you go over 35 years, it triggers a reassessment of the underlying land, not just the vines and the NLI. So always lease terms should be less than 35 years in this situation. Now, if you were a big shopping center and you were building a new big box store, of course, those leases can go out 75, 99 years. But in the vineyard business or any other lease, including radio cell sites or anything like that, you should really avoid going over a 35-year term, and that includes options. So if you had a 5-year term with 6 5-year options to renew, that puts you over the 35 years. So it includes any options written into the lease at the time the lease is signed. Okay, Emily, please. So one of the things that happens with leased land is that people think that because there's a lease on it, for some reason, it's changed the value of the land. And if they sell the property, the new buyer will in some way get a lower rate of property tax than if the land were not leased. Or in many cases, and we had one of those that I'll talk about in particular, if someone dies and we have to reassess the property because they don't have any children as heirs, and we'll talk about that under the Prop 19 slide. When they do the valuation for the death, often the appraiser will do what's called a leased fee analysis, which means what's left in value to the lessor, the person who died, after they signed the lease. And we had a case where the person had signed a really bad lease for a 20-year term, was not getting market rate on the land, was not getting an appropriate share of the crop. It was just a terrible lease. And when they died, the appraiser who was doing the appraisal of the estate used the bad lease to heavily discount the value of the property. Well, we do in the appraisal business, and it's not just in California, but pretty much throughout the country, we do what's known as the unencumbered fee simple value of the land on the event date. So as of the date this person died, we value both the lessor's interest, which might be lower because they had a bad lease, and the lessee's interest, which is very high because they have a good lease for them and a bad lease for the lessor. We combine those two values to come up with the unencumbered fee simple value. So where the appraisal came in with leased fee for the estate of the lessor at, let's say, $1.5 million, when we combine the value that the lessee had in the land of another $1 million, the value of the property as of the date of death was $2.5 million, not the leased fee interest done by the appraiser. It took us a while to convince the lessor and the family, of course, that when we did the reassessment of what we had done, but it's very clear that the law provides that, and I have articles on that if anybody's interested so they can see it. And as I've said, my job is to be fair, and fairness is that the entire value of the property should be assessed so that somebody with a lease on their property doesn't get a different value than exactly the same property down the street that's not leased and gets a higher value if the lease fee were applied to the first property. So the issue here is, as I said earlier, not raising revenue, but to be fair. Okay, Emily, please. Did we just skip one? Yes, thank you. So as you know, we've had a major impact from the fires. Some of that impact was not something the assessor worries about. Some of that was things like smoke taint on the grapes, and that's not something that we deal with, although it certainly is an impact on the property owner and on their income, but we do not look at the proceeds of the sale other than in the Williamson Act, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So we looked at the actual destruction done to the winery, the home, whatever else was destroyed or partially damaged in the fire, and that includes the vine and the non-living improvements. So we send the owner a calamity reassessment claim. We get the damage information from CAL FIRE and from aerial photos and from surveys that are done. And then we send anyone who is allegedly had damage a calamity reassessment claim and ask them to return it. They have a year to return it. We hope they'll do it more quickly than that. And in Napa County, our Board of Supervisors has allowed us to do on our own if we don't get a calamity claim from the property owner. So we make a temporary adjustment to the land value if there was a structure on it. We do not if there was just vines on it, but if there was a structure on it, there's hazardous waste removal that has to be done. So from the date of the fire to the end of that tax year, we give that land a 35% reduction. But that's temporary because once it's cleaned up, there's no reduction due. I mean, fire doesn't destroy land, it destroys what's on the land. But there is that temporary adjustment. That does not apply to lands that are solely planted to vineyards. And then, of course, as I said, we'll make a long-term adjustment to the structure, the non-living improvements, and the vines until they are rebuilt or replaced. They stay off the roll until they're replanted. And if they replanted essentially the same spacing and the same non-living improvements, in other words, if they don't put in a brand new, fancy, much higher quality vineyard, they'll get their old base year value back on those vines. They will not get a new base year value as if they'd torn the vines out and then replanted for reasons other than having fire having destroyed the vineyard. So I was asked this question a few weeks ago. What about smoke taint, possible impact on prices of grapes and production over the next few years? And the answer to that is yes. Under the Williamson Act, since we're looking at the income from the property, that could have an impact. It doesn't apply if you're under Proposition 13 because there is no income component to that. But if there are grape price adjustments for smoke taint or production is changed for a number of years, or if the vines, of course, have to be torn out and replanted, they get that 3-year exemption to begin with. There would be a reduction for grape price changes or production changes. But as I point out, that's going to be gradual because we use a multi-year average. And so there's not going to be a huge impact right away. It would be over the next 3 to 5 years, depending on whether it's grape prices or production. Okay, Emily, last slide. All right, so let me just give you a little background. Excuse me. In November of 2020, the voters passed Proposition 19. The main movers behind Proposition 19 were the realtors. And the main provision of Proposition 19 was to allow people anywhere in the state of California to change their principal residence to any other county in California and with adjustment take their base year value with them. That was the primary focus of Proposition 19. And what happened was the realtors attempted to do that in 2018, and they just dropped the whole idea because the firefighters and the unions were going to oppose it because they said that there was nothing in it for them. So as happens sometimes, the realtors came back to the legislature in 2019, and with the firefighters and the unions, they hashed out a compromise in which the base year value was allowed to proceed, but some money was supposed to be set aside for firefighting, and the people who were on the side of raising revenues asked that some of the parent-to-child provisions that had been in place since 1987 be restricted. And so the major restrictions of the parent-to-child that Proposition 19 put in, and I would say almost no voters understood that that was what was going to happen. All they saw was the benefit to those over 55 being able to move their base year value around the state. I don't think they understood or saw the consequences of what was going to happen to the parent to child exclusion, which is an important exclusion for keeping property in the family. So the two major changes in the parent to child were, one, that the child, if they inherited the principal residence, had to move into it and stay there. They could not inherit a principal residence and turn it into a rental. So that made a big impact because not every child wants to live in their parents' house. And it didn't mean that you could leave it still to 3 children, but one of the children had to actually live in the house. And if they moved out, they would lose the benefit of the parent to child unless another of their siblings moved in. So that was one big impact. The second big impact was it did not allow parents to grant any property other than principal residences to their children. No rental units, no commercial property, no industrial property. You could not transfer those to your children, period. It had to be your principal residence. So those were the two big changes. And what was exempted from that in Proposition 19 was the family farm. And that's what I want to talk about briefly. So those of you who are parents who own family farms, or if your children are going to give them back to your parent, that's another thing you could do. But if you're a parent who owns a family farm, you may make a transfer to your child with certain provisions that I'm going to go over. And this is a complex area. As I said at the beginning, the sorcerers in Sacramento are stirring the cauldron as we speak, and we don't know exactly what the law is going to look like when it comes out, but I will talk about what we think it'll look like. So if you own a family farm and have a principal residence on it, it's going to be treated separately from the rest of the farm. So if you have a 20-acre vineyard with a house on it that you live in the Napa Valley, and you're going to transfer that to your children, or you die and transfer it to your children that way, we're going to treat the two pieces of that property separately. First of all, the principal residence will be treated as a principal residence, including a reasonable amount of land around that residence, usually an acre or 2. It can be bigger if it's a huge property. I mean, if you've got a 1,000-acre ranch with a home site on it of 5 acres or 10 acres, where the principal residence is located, it could be that big. But on a vineyard property, it would probably be an acre at the most. The child must occupy that principal residence. They will not get the benefit of the parent to child unless one of the children occupies that principal residence and remains there. They can then pass it on to their children, who then have to live in it. But it has to be occupied by a family heir at some point in its existence to continue the benefit of the parent to child. So and I'm going to show you later what the examples are. The balance of the family farm receives a separate $1 million benefit. And as I'm saying, with the sorcery going on in Sacramento, it may be a $1 million benefit per parcel. So if you have a family ranch made up of 6 parcels of 200 acres each one of those may get the $1 million benefit. We don't know that yet, but that seems to be the trend. So here's an example. We have a 30-acre vineyard with a principal residence. The principal residence in the home site, 2 acres, is valued as of the date of the transfer at $2.5 million. Now, that's the value that we would put on it if there were no parent to child. So if that home and its 2-acre home site were just sold to somebody, not a child, we say it was worth $2.5 million. But the base year of that principal residence is only $450,000 because it's been in the family a while. So they get this $1 million benefit totally different from the old Prop 58 parent to child, which was totally different. But this is a new $1 million benefit. And by the way, that adjusts every 2 years based on the rise in the cost of housing. So in a couple of years, that could be $1.4 million or $1.8 million. But from now through 2023, it's going to be $1 million. So you take the 450,000, you add the million benefit to that for $1,450,000. So the value after transfer is the 2.5 million fair market value on the date of transfer minus the 1.45 million, which equals 1.05 million. And then you add the base year value back in, which is 1.5 million. So it's a tax savings of approximately $10,000. And those of you who are mathematicians can see that as you go through this process, you still end up with that $1 million benefit by the way the formula works. So that's what would happen with the principal residence and the home site treated separately. And it would have its own future base year value, which is not the case under current circumstances. Before this parent to child transfer, the 30-acre vineyard would have one value. After the parent to child value transfer, it'll have two values. One, it's still one parcel, but there'll be a value associated with the principal residence and its home site, and there'll be a separate value associated with the 28 acres of remaining vineyard. So if you could do the last slide, please, before my contact information. Oh, I think there it is, thank you. So here's how we value the 28 acres of vineyard. Remember, it's a family farm. It was one 30-acre parcel, so it remains and we're not splitting the parcel. Let me make clear here, because we're going to have an assessment for the house and the home site and an assessment for the vineyard. That doesn't mean two legal parcels were created. These are separated for assessment purposes. They are one legal parcel, still 30 acres with a house and vineyard. It's just we're going to be assessing it differently. So the fair market value of the vineyard at $350,000 per acre is $9.8 million on the day of the transfer. The Proposition 13 base year value of the vineyard is $2.5 million on the day of the transfer. So assuming there's the $1 million benefit, we take the 2.5 million base year value, add $1 million to 3.5. 9,800,000 minus 3.5 million is 6.3 million, plus the 2.5 million base year. So we added 6.3 million here. In the old days, nothing would have been added before Prop 19 as long as something else didn't trigger it. Well, actually, something would have been added in this case. And we now have an $8.8 million new base year value, which is still that $1 million savings. So the savings are still $10,000. So there'd be a $20,000 savings combined between the principal residence and the balance of the vineyard. But on the whole, the value of the property has gone up substantially to 8.8 million plus 1.5 million for the two combined, which is 9.3 million. So the property tax went from approximately $3 million to, from $30,000 to almost $95,000. So there's still an increase, but it would have been even higher without the parent to child exclusion. So I've packed a lot of information into a short period of time, and I understand that. And as I said, if you could give the last slide, you don't need to, Emily, thanks. You don't need to write this down because you're going to get it on your computer screen, but this is where you'll reach me. So with that, I see, Emily, that there's at least one question.
There is. So a question for you, John, is can you address the change in inheritance tax basis for vineyard properties without a home?
I'm not sure I understand that question, so let me think about it. So first of all, we're only as the county assessor and our staff, we only do property tax valuation. We're not involved with inheritance tax valuation. That all has to do with CPAs and estate planning attorneys, et cetera. So I have not a clue. Let me just say that I do know two things that are going on. There's talk in Washington, D.C. of reducing the very high exclusion that now exists of $11 million per person who died, meaning a couple would have a $22 million exclusion. There's talk about reducing that for estate tax purposes. The other thing that's being talked about is no longer allowing the step up in basis as of a death, which means that in the current law, if you die and your property has a value of $1 million, but on the day you die, it's worth $5 million, the heirs get that $5 million without having to worry about paying tax on it because it would have been taxed inside the estate. There's talk in Washington of taking that away, and that in addition to the estate tax, there would be capital gains tax on that $4 million in change in value at the date of death. So those are some big issues that anyone on this seminar should be able to rush off to their estate planning attorneys and talk to them about it. And with that, Emily, I'm happy for any other questions. And otherwise, as you know, or your audience doesn't know, I'm going to have to jump off for other things. So I'm happy, as I said, once you have my contact information, I prefer email because it's easier than having to play telephone tag. So please email me with your questions. By the way, I want to say they are considered confidential if you ask me a question, unless I am charged by my constitutional duties. If I discover something needs a reassessment that I didn't know about until you told me, I'm going to have to do that. I don't have to tell anybody about it. But if you ask me a question, and I had this example just the other day where someone asked me a question about this strange trust his father had created, and I was working on it with him, and then I found out his father had died 8 years ago, and now we're going to have to go back and reassess the property for 8 years of escape assessment. So I just wanted people to know that everything's confidential until I find that something needs to be reassessed, and at that point I must act on it.
My. Well, good to know. Thank you, John.
My pleasure.
And with that, I will let Tony take it away for our second portion. Tony, are you able to share your screen as well?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Emily. Can you see my screen?
It is looking, I can see the lead up slides, but it's up to you if you want it. There it is. Perfect.
There we are. Okay. Well, thanks, Emily. And I would offer thanks to John Tudor. And I hope everyone in Napa County recognizes what a great asset you have in John. I've done a lot of property tax valuation work and a lot of assessment appeals, et cetera. Sat on an appeals board for 12 years myself. And I can tell you, John is absolutely one of the best assessors, and his entire office are some of the best in California. And he really is open to questions. If you want to ask him what's happening, feel free to go down there, or you could, talk to your attorney at $600 an hour. It's your choice. I'm going to talk about vineyard valuations here for a little bit. And I'll start my big red alarm clock here so I don't go over time. And I'm going to start with a little bit of history, looking back over the year 2020, which of course was not one of our best years. If we look at what happened in the years prior to that, from 12 through 18, we had extraordinary high production, relatively high prices, a little hiccup here and there until 2020, and then things just fell off the table. And what did that mean to growers? Remember, the wine business is cyclical. This is Bill Turrentine's Wine Business Wheel of Fortune. He used to call it the manic depressive Wheel of Fortune. And it's a recurring cycle, and it's basically just a matter of supply and demand. When demand is high, grape prices are high, and everybody plants a lot of vineyard. When demand is very low and supply is high, the reverse is true, and people start pulling out vineyards. And the thing we have to remember is you can never underestimate the ability of the American farmer to overproduce any profitable crop. If grapes are expensive, you can sell your grapes for $10,000 a ton, well, then people are necessarily going to plant a lot of vineyards, and they'll produce a lot of grapes, and eventually that leads to overproduction, and then we see the reverse of the cycle. I've been writing about that cycle for more than a while. This was an article I published with my friend Brockmeyer a few years ago, 20 years ago exactly, in the Wine Business Monthly magazine, where we talked about the recurring cycle. So now the question is, we have all these other things going on. We have the pandemic. We had wildfires. We had smoke taint issues. So does that mean the cycle's broken? No, it's just this time it's different, which is a dangerous thing to say in terms of financial investments. But this time it is different, but it's still the same. If we look at the big picture of global wine production and consumption, now this only goes through 2016, but what you see is that we have increased production more than we have increased consumption. And remember, grapes are a perishable commodity, so they're fragile. You pick them off the vine, you've only got a little while to do something with them. But once you make it into wine, that's a storable commodity. So if one year you have too much wine, you carry that over the next year, and you start your next year with too much wine, and that just snowballs as you go down the road. It's kind of like Portuguese people, they age well. So looking back, we went through the Great Recession of 2008 and then 2009. And as we emerged in 10 and 11, people started drinking a lot more wine, or more expensive wine. And we had short crops in 10 and 11. And so we experienced a little bit of a grape shortage, and the wineries recognized that and went out and started buying vineyards, buying land, and planting more vineyards. And so the demand was going, wine sales were good, and prices kept going up. If you look back, we'll look at this in a second here. You look at the grape prices from 12 through 17, we had a big boom in grape prices. So everybody jumped into the game. We had, financial funds started investing in land, planting vineyards, et cetera, et cetera. So saw this sea change in grape and vineyard pricing, which was wonderful for those years. And now we have to remember basic economics. And this is a quote that is relevant. We saw a lot of new land brought into production, created oversupply of grapes, but that production created a glut, which became evident 3 years ago. So you would think this quote is current, but no, this came from 1879, when we experienced the same thing again and again and again. So 2018, we had a great big crop, and we started experiencing the fact that we had an oversupply of grapes, which was leading into an oversupply of bulk wines. And that started things backing up. We saw it first down in the Paso Robles market, when there was a lot of Cabernet in the Paso area that wasn't sold, wasn't picked, and some of it was sold at Central Valley prices of $300 to $500 a ton, which doesn't do much for the grower. And then in the vineyard markets, if you didn't have a home for your grapes, if you didn't have a contract to sell your grapes, it was very difficult to sell vineyards, because the buyer would look at it, there was no way for them to make a profit by operating that vineyard. But we continue to see lifestyle buyers, and we're going to talk about them for a little bit. So from 2018 through 2020, we were dealing with a surplus of grapes and bulk wine. And so that changed things quite a bit. And at the same time, wine sales were slowing. They were still growing, but at the growth of rate was slowing while our production was increasing. We were also facing real competition, especially amongst the younger consumers, from other options. We have craft beer, spirits, seltzers, hard seltzers have become a really serious competitor for wine. And we also had the fact of legal weed. So you had all these things competing for the share of the younger consumer. And demographics are a very important part of this because the consumer base is changing. All those old baby boomers, et cetera, are all slowly slowing down, and we don't drink and buy as much wine as we used to. So the young consumers are being somewhat seduced by other options, and that is kind of worrying to the wine business. Before we start talking about Napa, I just want to remember everyone that there's all these different methods of measuring wine regions. In the world, you have geographical indications. Here in America, we have the American viticultural areas. Napa Valley is an AVA, Oakville is an AVA, Russian River Valley is an AVA, Paso Robles is an AVA. We also have counties. The California state, of course, has to do things differently, so they have a different system of grape reporting districts. And then you have functions of terroir, which recognize certain areas. And then you get to the point of even designating vineyards or blocks or rows. And I now understand that there's a new proposition brewing that'll be on the next ballot to reorganize the state into different regions based on geography and demographics and economics and various other characteristics, which would reorganize the state into 6 different states. We would fall, and Napa, we would fall into the Merlot state, which somehow or other gathers in Sacramento also. But let's talk about Napa Valley. Napa Valley is an extraordinarily valuable brand. And we need to remember that Napa Valley is not just a location, it's a brand. If we look here now, at the end of 2019, we had an extraordinary amount of bulk wine available. And this is just Cabernet Sauvignon, but the bulk wine inventory we're building up. We went into the 2019 crop. It wasn't a great big one like 2018, but it was big enough to continue building the supply. Did I go backwards? Yep. So we began 2020 with an oversupply of grapes and bulk wine in January. And then the icing on the cake, so to speak, was the COVID pandemic with the global quarantines, shelter in place, SIP. The economies were shut down. People weren't working. They were staying at home and working. Kids were home from school. Restaurants and tasting rooms were closed. So people sitting at home with husband, wife, 2 kids, 3 kids, all sitting in the same apartment or house all day, every day, all day. So the adults were drinking a lot more. But for the beginning of that, they were drinking less spendy wine. It continued as we went on April, May, June, July. All day, every day, people were sheltered in place, working at home. The kids were home from school. Everybody's enjoying their family every day, all day. Unemployment, of course, skyrocketed after the March shutdown, but the government began pumping cash into homes and markets, free money, and the interest rates were also near zero. So that meant people could drink better wine. So we have the house arrest, drink the best phenomenon, where people were drinking a lot of wine, and wine sales actually went up. people were drinking a lot more wine. They were found out what they could do online, that they could access lots and lots of fine wine and have it shipped to their to ship to their home or wherever they were. But at the same time, people were locked up at home. So we began to see, as things opened up a little bit, people left the cities because of the virus, because of the quarantines, et cetera, and started moving, either buying or renting country and vineyard estates at unprecedented rates. And this was a global phenomenon. It happened all over the world. I tend to call the phenomenon of the Corona refugees leaving the cities, and they want turnkey homes ready to move in. They're not interested in going out and buying a lot and build, taking the 2 or 3 years it takes to go through the planning process and construction and design, et cetera. They wanted to be able to move in. They want it, and they want it now. So again, if we look back in history, has this phenomenon happened before? This quote, and you'll get a PDF of my presentation afterwards, and you can read this at your leisure, but people were leaving the city and out to the country to where they can enjoy their life a little bit better and the kids could have some place to run around. And is this a recent phenomena? This quote comes from 1664, a journal of the plague year in London, written by Daniel Defoe. This is an astounding historical event. This is the plague wall. This was built in the south of France in 1720, more than a few years ago. When the plague was coming in from the east, they recognized it would come from the east, and the Kingdom of France and the Catholic Pope joined forces to build the wall and man it with their soldiers. And it was very simple. It was a de facto quarantine. So people coming up from the south, primarily from Marseille, where the plague was centered, were turned away. And if they chose not to turn away, then they were simply killed. So we've been dealing with this phenomenon for literally centuries and centuries. And on top of that, in August, it's 2020, the wildfires hit, unprecedented levels of wildfires. And just huge losses, especially in the North Coast. Napa Valley suffered incredible losses. Famous wineries, resorts, Meadowwood burned, vineyards, houses, up and down the coast. And the fires and the pandemic were both happening as we went into harvest. And then, of course, the fires led to smoke taint, which had an enormous impact upon the crop. And people were challenged with whether or not to pick if they thought they had smoke taint, and the insurance was telling them, well, you can pick or not pick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people had to make a lot of very hard decisions. But the bottom line was the crop was greatly reduced. The prices to the growers were greatly reduced. So that's how we saw, looking at just at Napa Cabernet, this enormous drop in production, and at the same time, a great drop in pricing. And that led to a huge loss in the total value of the Napa County Cabernet Sauvignon crop. If we look back just a few years earlier, we had a run again from the years 12 through 19, where the average crop value was over 450 million. And then all of a sudden we're down to 270 million in 2020. And what happened to the bulk inventory? With no 2020 crop, wineries started buying up the bulk inventory, buying up 19 and 18 bulk that was still available and was sitting out there. And a lot of wineries were able to buy up a lot of that at very low prices, which allowed them to restock their inventory so they could continue to have wine to sell. But then we had a lot of functions where, with cheap Napa Valley Cabernet bulk available, we saw things like, this is a current happening right now in Costco. Precision Napa Valley Cabernet selling for $12.99. If we're worried about protecting the brand of Napa Valley, is this a good thing? Yes and no. It's moving a lot of that bulk wine through the pipeline and get it out of the tanks. But if the consumer gets used to seeing a Napa Valley Cabernet for $12.99, are they going to be willing to pay $70 for one 2 years down the road when the world is restored? We're going to move now to talk about vineyard markets and how much is a vineyard worth and what's happening. This is a quote from a trends report. If you're not familiar with it, this is published annually by the California chapter of farm managers and rural appraisers. It's available online. I think it's a cost of $30 for the full report to download it. And in Napa Valley, the survey breaks Napa Valley into 3 different markets: prime markets, which are obvious: Oakville, Rutherford, Howell Mountain, Spring Mountain, etc. The secondary market is Yountville, Oak Knoll, Coombsville, and some of the hills that are less recognized than, say, Howell Mountain or Pritchard Hill. Outlying market: Childs Valley, Pope Valley. And beginning with last year, so this is the 2020 survey. Beginning in 19, the survey began to move Carneros into the outlying market from the secondary market due to the lack of activity in the Carneros AVA. So these are the vineyard values that are reported in the survey for the calendar year 2020. And an important distinction to recognize here, Robert and Josh are going to follow, and they're going to be talking numbers in terms of price per acre, but they're flying over Napa Valley in their private jet at 35,000 feet, and they're looking at a much broader perspective. They're looking at the entire business of a winery, and their perception of a price per acre is different from what I, as an appraiser, and my colleagues, we're down in the dirt, we're kicking the clods, and we're trying to figure out how much of the value of this 1 acre of vineyard is worth itself. And we break out the contributory values of the house that might be on a vineyard. If there's no house, there might be a home site value in a Napa Valley, a home site, just the site, just the legal entitlement and the physical site could be worth 2 million, 3 million, 5 million. We've seen sites as high as 10 million for some of the more dramatic sites. But we break out all those extra assets to get down to just the value of the vineyards. And if we look at, this is a chart, or I combine the vineyard prices ranges out of the report, the trends report, with overlays of grape pricing. So the black line down at the bottom is the average price of all white varieties in Napa Valley or District 4, overlaid against the value ranges for the outlying areas. And then we take the average Cabernet price for the secondary areas, and then the 90th percentile cab price for the prime area vineyards. So you can see how each of those grape prices follow or push, I should say, the vineyard values. And if you look at that, you'll notice that, when we had the downturn of the Great Recession, both the average price of the whites and the average Cabernet price declined, as did vineyard values during the recession and the aftermath. But the upper end, the primary vineyards, excuse me, and the 90th percentile plateaued for a while in 9, 10, 11, but they never declined. So this drop that we see in 2020 is it's somewhat of a new event for Napa Valley. You have to go all the way up past the 95th percentile to see stable pricing for the 2020 vintage. So this is a chart of actual vineyard sales that we track in Napa Valley. And this is the net price per acre of individual transactions, and they're categorized by AVA. So we have quite a lot of activity in Oak Knoll and in Yountville. We have a few things in Rutherford. And most recently, and this is kind of intriguing to me, is we're seeing quite a lot of activity in Carneros, which had been very slow for many years. We have the high point, of course, which is over $550,000 per acre, is from a very small, super premium vineyard up on top of the Oakville Ridge on the east side of the valley. And we do see vineyards that sell for more than $500,000 an acre, but they're typically very small, super premium with established histories of very high grape prices that go into very expensive bottles of wine. And people are willing to pay up for that quiet type of revenue stream. Conversely, we see a lot of vineyards, and you can see vineyards even in some of the higher priced Oakville, Rutherford, St. Helena AVAs. Not every vineyard in Rutherford is a super premium vineyard. You've got some, vineyards that are not quite up to par. On the other hand, you've got vineyards that are super spectacular. And so there's always a range in values within any AVA. But as we can see in Oak Knoll now, we see a little bit of a downturn in the last year. And this is probably a function of, we saw a big run up in Oak Knoll, probably more so in Oak Knoll than anywhere in Napa Valley, when we were going through those boom years of 12 to 18. In 16, 17, and 18, we saw Oak Knoll land and vineyard values jump fairly dramatically. And now that little boom is seems to be over a little bit, and they are stabilizing. And my belief is that Napa Valley vineyards, there's always a buyer for a Napa Valley vineyard. In some cases, if you're not the best, if you don't have a home for the grapes, if the buyer doesn't think they're going to be able to sell the grapes for a good price, then you may suffer a little bit of a declining value. But over the long run, the difference in Napa Valley is there's always buyers for Napa Valley vineyards. That's not true in many other cases in the state. There may be buyers, but they may be at vulture buyers at very low rock bottom prices, which we're seeing in some places. Now, of course, the defining event of 2020, we had fires in 17 and 18, 19, but 2020 was unprecedented level of fires. So what happened after the fires? There was possibly one small benefit from the fires, and that's the emergency rules for timber harvest. So timber could now be harvested without going through the lengthy and costly delay of achieving a timber harvest permit. So the burnt snags on burnt over properties could be harvested and hauled off to a lumber mill and even sold as lumber, if you could find somebody to cut the trees down, and if you could find somebody to load the trees on a truck, and if you could find a mill that didn't have burnt over logs already stacked up waiting for processing. But that timber harvest is allowing a lot of land to be cleared that will become plantable land that would have taken years and years to achieve that timber harvest prior to the fires. Homeowners that were burnt out, many of them are choosing not to rebuild on their burnt over properties. There's a number of factors: current high costs of construction. And if anyone has tried to build or remodel a home or any structure in the last year, you understand that lumber has gone from 300 to 500% increase in price in the last year. We also have very long delays being going through reprinting, et cetera, and getting a design. So it could be several years before you'd be able to clear your burnt over site, get your plans approved, design your house, and actually build the house so that you could move back in. Fire insurance. That's a big item right now. That is probably one of the big questions that's happening out there is, what does fire insurance cover? How much is it going to cost? And what kind of coverage do I actually get when it's said and done? The cost of premiums is skyrocketing. So what we're saying is many of the displaced owners from hillside homes are becoming buyers on the valley floor. So we have another set of buyers besides the Corona refugees. We've got displaced fire victims that are now looking for homes on the valley floors. This chart is for what we call vineyard estates. So these are properties in Napa Valley that are more than 3 acres, less than 30 acres or less, with a house of a minimum of 2,000 square feet up to about as high as 10,000 square feet. And these fall into a range of roughly 2 million to under 8.5 million. And so each one of these data points is a sale of a property that fits those criteria. So if we look at this over this time period, this is 1 year, and this is an extraordinary amount of those types of sales. And again, we're talking about sales from 2 million to 8.5. And if we plot this out over this year's time, this means about once every 10 days, one of these properties has been selling. Now, this may be slowing down a little bit. I mean, just a little bit, but it's still, there's a lot of buyers who want their home in the country. But again, they're looking for turnkey, ready to move in properties. And for the people who are burnt out, these deals are often driven by their fire insurance coverages, both in terms of buying properties and also renting properties. A lot of homes were rented at very, very high prices because people had good coverage from their fire insurance. This is one I find interesting. This is an auction that is happening right now. This is a property up on Spring Mountain. Was listed as high as $33 million. It's now on auction today. It's been on auction for, I think, the last week or so, and it's got a little bit longer to go. And it was listed as high as $33 million. The minimum bid for the auction is $20 million for this rather dramatic Tuscan estate up in the hills with these wonderful views and all this wonderful greenery. And this is the picture out of the marketing brochure for the auction. And this is the aerial view I just pulled off of Google Earth of this property last week. And so you'll notice a distinct lack of green around the house. And that's all fire residue. All this property was burned over. They saved the house and grounds, but now you have instead of that beautiful view of all those wonderful trees and long views over the valley, you've got this view of all these burnt trees. And this is it's certainly a chilling effect on the value of these properties in the hills. People move to the hills because they want privacy, they want view, they love the aesthetics of all the greenery, etc. And now all that is gone. And people ask me, how much does that impact the value of a property? I don't know. The market's going to tell us as we go through this, and more and more people buy some of these burnt over properties, and we can compare them to what happened to properties before the fires when they had all the aesthetics and the privacy, et cetera, the trees. So we'll sort that out as we go over, but we have to wait for the market to tell us. All we know now is there's a lot of folks that don't want to go up to the hills. The brokers tell me that the people just don't want to consider homes in the burnt over areas right now. People are looking for the valley floor where they can get the same sort of things. They can get views, they can get aesthetics, they can get privacy without going up into the fire prone areas. So after we go through the lockdown, and this is still a major thing for the wine industry, what's going to happen when we're out of the pandemic, out of the quarantine period? I think a lot of people discovered the benefits and the joys of buying wine online, but we're also seeing people flocking back to the tasting rooms and the restaurants. And I think there's going to be a resurgence in all that. My friend Rob McMillan at Silicon Valley Bank suggests that there may be a return to the roaring 20s and people will spend a lot of money. Folks in general have a lot of capital to spend, and they'll go out and spend it. If what I've seen in the last few weeks, people are eager to go out and they're buying bottles of sparkling wine. They're buying a lot more bottles of hard seltzer or cans of hard seltzer, but that's another thing. But people are buying and they're back out and they want to have a party and they want to have a good time and they want to have a good bottle of wine. The impact on the workers who have been out of work for so much time, especially in the hospitality venues, the restaurants, the taste rooms, et cetera. It's been a very tough road for them, and we'll see how many of them actually moved out to somewhere else and how many will stick around and come back to work. A few quotes here on one of the M&A brokers, not Robert, said, it's hard to see how the winery M&A market could get much worse, but I don't see any lessened demand. There's still an awful lot of demand, as Robert will tell us, from foreign folks who want to buy in Napa Valley. Napa Valley is world famous territory. So again, the difference between now and some of the other negative experiences we've had in the past is that in Napa Valley, there's always buyers, good times and bad. There's always buyers. Now, they may change their perspective and what they're willing to pay, but there's always buyers for Napa Valley. My good friend Mike Veseth, the wine economist, published a very extensive guide for the overwhelm regarding the wine business in 2020, and rather succinctly summarized it with his picture from the screen: total chaos. But hopefully we're through all of that now and we're moving ahead. And the thing we need to remember is that nature and the wine industry is incredibly resilient. We'll bounce back from this. In a few years, we'll all be fat, dumb, and happy again and rolling down the road. So it's not the end of the world. But there are a lot of challenges, risks. There's problems and there's opportunities. We continue to see consolidation in the wine business, the bigger getting bigger. There's always problems with global economics. Trade issues, tariffs are stupid. The strength of the US dollars, of course, changes our currency exchange rates, et cetera. Climate change is a very big issue. Some folks have hypothesized that the reason we're seeing activity in Carneros is because people are perceiving climate change and they're going to grow Cabernet Sauvignon in Carneros. May be true. But the bottom line, one of my great fears is we're seeing the classic case of the definition of inflation: too much money chasing too few goods. There's just enormous bags of dollars out there looking for some place to park. And ag land has always been a safety valve for investment funds. And if you're going to invest in ag land, wine grape vineyards, and especially Napa Valley wine grape vineyards, are the sexiest ag land that you can buy. So we're seeing a lot of folks kicking around, private equity funds, um, lots and lots of the pension funds, investment funds, et cetera. We even saw a SPAC with Vintage Wine Estates being um, partnering up with a SPAC to go public, and Duckhorn going public with their stock now sold on the New York Stock Exchange. So California vineyards as a whole have always been a good investment, although, you know, people can still lose money in the game. But overall, the underlying land value has always been a good investment. It tends to hold its value, and in premium areas like Napa Valley, appreciate considerably. And the risk of agriculture in general depends upon the quality of the property. So the better quality properties enjoy less risk. The opposite is true. Wineries go through these differing philosophical decisions about owning vineyards and owning land. And it's a question that comes up, and they seem to reverse course every 5 or 10 years, with winery business thinking the vineyards are the critical part of the winemaking process. And then the accountants are saying, no, they're lazy assets. We don't want to own land. We can lease the vineyards. We can contract for the grapes. We don't want to own the land and the vineyards because they're too lazy. They lower our return. There are always tax benefits, and today there's considerable tax benefits to vineyard ownership and to buying a new vineyard. One of the things that is unique to the wine business is that the AVA, the American Viticultural Area, is considered by the IRS to be an intangible asset, so you can amortize it off of your income tax. And again, specifically to Napa Valley, we've got an incredible climate, a very benevolent, and excluding things like wildfires, we have relatively consistent vintages, more so than many of the old world areas, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Chianti, et cetera. So we can produce consistent vintages over time, and we can produce strong production of those good vintages. What we have seen in the last few years, and I think is a danger for Napa Valley, is a lot of what we call appellation creep. So wineries that are making for example, an Oakville Cabernet, and as times change and their business model changes, that Oakville Cabernet then becomes a Napa Valley Cabernet, and then it becomes a North Coast Cabernet, and then it becomes a California red blend. As you move downstream, if you try to produce more and more production, more cases, then you have to expand your source area. So we saw a lot of the secondary areas kind of bleeding into the premium areas. Oak Knoll is a classic example. Traditionally a secondary area. We saw a big surge in demand. People bought a lot of land, planted a lot of Cabernet because they were getting District 4 averages for their grapes. That trend is somewhat reversing itself now because the secondary areas are now having a little bit lower prices for their grapes, but they're still able to sell the grapes. The grape market has firmed up considerably in the last several months. One of the phenomenons in the vineyard market is that marginal areas, and that would be the outlying areas over the hills, which tend to be hotter and colder, they always see the greatest strength and the rising prices in up markets. But when markets turn down, which they always do, those outlying areas, those marginal areas always suffer the most during the down market period. As my friend Steve Fredericks at Turrentine said, the rising tide lifts all boats, but we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So, what keeps you up at night? Insurance and fires. If the coronavirus persists, we're all in trouble. I don't know that we could go through another global quarantine or even a local quarantine. Um, and of course, if that virus persisted, could lead to global economic and political collapse and the end of the world. There's also the risk of insurance and fires and insurance, currency exchange rates, changing consumer preferences uh, for the younger generations is a real issue for the wine business. Labor is a continuing problem. I don't think that's going to get any better. And then there's also the risk of fires and insurance and fires and insurance. And then the usual risks of vine diseases and pests and monocultures, et cetera. A big issue, which is going to be more and more restrictive, is water. We're in a terrible drought right now. Reservoirs are low. We're going to face restrictions on groundwater pumping. The state enacted the California State Groundwater Management Act, SIGMA, we call it, and that's going to reduce pumping in many, many, many areas in the state. Water is going to be critical. And in the Central Valley now, where you have the big water systems and the big growers and water districts and municipalities buy and sell water amongst themselves, the price of water has gone up from a couple $100 an acre foot to most recently it's in the range of $1,500 to $2,000 an acre foot. Most of the folks that I talk to expect it to go up as high as $2,500 for an acre foot of water by next month as we go through the peak of a long hot summer. And I see my big red alarm clock is thinking, so it's I'm done, and I'll just leave you here with my usual thing. Please drink more Napa wine. Emily, do we have any questions?
We do have a couple. All right, are you ready? So can you please address how you go about calculating AVA values for a particular vineyard?
That's a big question. There's several different approaches that I use, and the two basic ones are looking at differentials in land prices. An acre of land in Rutherford will sell for more than an acre of land in Calistoga versus an acre of land in Sonoma County. And I look at those and I have a big databases of land sales by categorized by AVA. And I do all these tricky analysis to figure that out. And then I also look at grape prices, which are hard to track because the Grape Crush report doesn't track grape prices by AVA, but they use their 17 districts, which doesn't correlate. So we look at finished wine prices, look at bulk wine prices, that those are also hard to use. So I look at finished wine prices and say a bottle of Oakville Cabernet sells for X dollars more than a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet. I reverse engineered those differences, those deltas, I reverse engineer them back to land value and use whatever I can to put it together, and then I reconcile on a value for the AVA.
My goodness. Well, kind of a follow-up to that is, what are your thoughts? Why are there so few sales in Calistoga?
That's a good question. I think we may see some more as we go along, but it's always been curious to me. Calistoga's farther up valley, tends to be hotter, but there's a lot of very good wine that comes out of Calistoga. And with all the activity, most of the wine business is dependent on tourism, direct to consumer sales. And with all the activity in the new resorts that are being built in Calistoga, I would expect we'll see a lot of tourism up there as we emerge from the pandemic. And if you have a lot of tourists up there, then I think we'll start to see more action up there, and we may see more sales of vineyards and wineries as we go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tony.
Welcome.
With that, I will welcome Robert and Josh to join the Zoom screen. I'll help you guys out. Nope. Let's get you off mute, Robert. There you go. Hi.
How are you?
Hi. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Tony and John, for great presentations. I know Tony well enough to know that he's actually not a subscriber to the collapsist theory that one or two of those last slides might have suggested. He's a very optimistic man indeed, and but thank you for your great presentations, and thank you, Jennifer Putnam, for and Emily and Quincy for organizing this today. Great to see everybody, and looking forward to taking you through a couple of things here on the next slide. We'll just moving that on. So we'll go through a right. So Josh, take us through the background of IWA, and there we go. So we'll go through a little bit of the background of IWA, who we are, some recent transactions that we've done, and then look at what drives buyers of Vineyards and what's happened in the recent past with some supply and demand issues. And then we'll look at the way we value wineries and vineyards at IWA, and some just a snip on some thoughts for the future. Thank you. Next slide.
Right. Good morning, everyone. We are International Wine Associates. We are a boutique mergers and acquisition firm, which means we handle transactions on vineyards, wineries, and brands. We are almost exclusively in the wine business. We do a little bit of spirits deals once in a while, but we are all from the wine business originally. Robert started in Bordeaux many years ago. I think they made wine in amphora still back then. And I worked at Mondavi in Napa Valley for a few years before coming over here. Robert's been doing this for 30 years. I've been doing it for 20 years. His wife is our broker in California and Oregon. I have licenses in California and Washington, so we cover the entire West Coast. And we were recently joined by Catherine, who came from Goldman Sachs.
So since 1990, we've done a few transactions, about $2 billion in value in California, Oregon, and Washington. As Josh says, we have companies there. So these are a few of our recent deals since 2016, 6 of which are in the Napa Valley. And we've done about, we sold about 700 acres of Napa Valley vineyards since the beginning, and just over $500 million of total transaction value.
Just quickly, one more slide on us. This is the list of most of our Napa transactions. We did a number of them last year, 3 in fact. Burgess was sold to Heights. Roederer bought Diamond Creek, and we sold the Flora Springs estate, not the brand, to the Catillard family of Chateau Smith-Haute Lafitte. Have done probably about 25 total transactions in Napa, starting in 1993. When Robert sold the Greystone building to the CIA.
So looking at some recent winery transactions, just to get a perspective on wineries and vineyards here, some of you certainly would notice, you know some of these transactions. Interesting of note, perhaps, that the 4 of these were acquired by French companies. Roederer on Diamond Creek last March, Catillard buying the Flora Springs estate from Chateau Smith-Haute Lafitte, and then AXA Millésime buying Outpost up on Howell Mountain. So I think that this is just a snapshot of the general transactions in the winery business in the Napa Valley. It's not every single transaction, but it's most of the important ones. And it sums to about a value of just over $1 billion, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about it, since I think the first one here is May of 2016. So it's been a pretty active market, and I think I'm cautiously optimistic for the future, and Josh and I can certainly go through that and explain a little bit why we are thinking that way with regard to the Napa Valley. But I think that there are some nuances that we also want to try and point out today. Next slide.
Right. So this is some more specifics on recent Napa Valley Vineyard transactions. A lot of these were pretty similar to what Tony has, a little more detail here in terms of who the buyer and seller were, number of acres, and those are planted vine acres, not gross acres of the parcel, the price paid and the price per acre. And Tony's right in what he said. In some respects, we don't pay as much attention to some of the home site contributions and so on. We're really looking at the economics of why a buyer would buy any of these vineyards. What's notable on this list, and this isn't every vineyard that is transacted in the last 24 months, but it is most of them. What is interesting when you look at this is that of the buyers here, only Stag's Leap Wine Cellars bought a vineyard, and that was one in Calistoga that they intended to use for their own use. Every other transaction on here was actually a grape grower, which reverses a trend we've seen increasingly over the last 10, 15 years, where wineries were more often the acquirer. You can also see here, there's only one transaction in Rutherford, which is, to Tony's point, that's the only one in a prime region. The rest of these are all secondary. And as he showed, we see a lot of transactions in Yountville, Carneros, Oak Knoll, and typically at prices that are a bit less than what we saw in 17, 18. And you're seeing, you're seeing a little bit of cab encroachment, which we'll talk about later, from buyers who are coming to areas that were less dominated by Cabernet plantings and paying prices that, say $250 an acre, that makes that, an attractive acquisition to replant Cabernet.
Next slide. Thank you. So what is it that drives buyers? I think that all vineyard buyers, frankly, are investors, and people are making this investment seeking some sort of a return. But I think the industry that we're in is unique, and we find this consistently talking to buyers. While IWA only represents sellers, we talk to all the buyers. Some buyers are certainly willing to accept what we would consider lower returns than generally in the market, in the financial market, or in other industries. Ego can play a little bit of a role here, but I think the market performance sort of is rational, and I think that's an important thing that we all need to recognize as we look at the world that we operate in today. Interestingly, there have always been foreign buyers that have looked in Napa. Over the years, you can track this from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and they look to Napa as a secure place to make an investment in a winery or in a vineyard asset. And often they are companies who have been, or families who have been in, are presently in the wine business in their home country. So they generally have, the foreign overseas buyers generally have a very long-term view about what they're looking for. Sometimes it gives them access to market, having a foothold in California, and specifically when they're looking in the Napa Valley, gives them a foothold in the most prestigious AVA in the United States, and one of the most prestigious AVAs in the world, obviously. And they're sometimes looking for an investment for future generations, and also as a hedge, perhaps sometimes for political issues that are going on in their own countries. And certainly that's the case with Europe, with what's happening in high tax environments, and concerns over the shift in the political winds. I think typically we might all agree that vineyard buyers in the Napa Valley have been grape growers. They've been farmers selling their fruit to wineries. And as the Napa Valley has evolved, and as the Napa Valley has grown in its worldwide acceptance, vineyard supply has generally stopped growing, and increasing vineyard prices have kept farming returns to the point where wineries have become the primary vineyard buyers. And that's basically their attempt to protect the supply as vineyard values have shifted. And I think that's a very important element that we all need to think about as we look at this as vineyard owners and as winery owners, protecting our supply in the Napa Valley. Interesting to note that there are numerous recent transactions where the buyers intends to sell the grapes, indicating that wineries have been less active most recently as the buyers, and that perhaps could put some downward pressure on vineyard values. Next slide, please.
So a few slides coming now talking about supply and demand. I don't think there'll be any surprises on this slide. Wanted to show folks what evolved between 2005 and 2019. We were going to use the 2020 data, but as you saw from what Tony showed with the decline in tons and the volatility in prices, we decided to use 2019 as an easier place for a compare. We're hoping that 2020 isn't part of the trend, but we do want to talk about that risk as well. What you see here is not surprising. Took out about the same amount of Merlot as Cab was planted, 3,000 acres decrease in Merlot, 3,000 acre increase in Cabernet. Interesting that Chardonnay decreased 500 acres. That surprised me, but I think if you look at that, that's not so much in Carneros as it's probably more up valley, Chardonnay, Oak Knoll and that region had a lot of Chardonnay removed and planted to Cabernet, which is part of the trend that we want to discuss as well a little bit. Overall, with Bordeaux varietals, you can see that they've now become 60% of overall Napa plantings. And if you look north of Napa, it's certainly well north of 60%, ever approaching 100%, it feels like. This slide looks at grape prices, tons, and equivalent cases produced. Some important notes here. Cabernet has grown over the 14-year period between 2005 and 2019 at a 26% annual price increase per ton. Compared to Merlot, which has been much maligned, Merlot still grew 15% annually. Chardonnay grew about the same rate at 13% annually. Those are obviously well above inflation, and Cabernet particularly raises some questions about sustainability and whether the market will continue to bear that. If you look down below where the arrows are, you see 2.9 million cases of just varietal Cabernet. That doesn't include the implied Malbec, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc, and Merlot that would be blended in here. But that's about 3 million cases of Cabernet produced annually from Napa. And if you use the 1% rule with Napa at just under $8,000 per ton in 2019, that implies an $80 bottle average, which means Napa produced 3 million cases of wine that should have sold, if the 1% rule holds, at $80 a bottle. This picture, which you will see, which we stole from Tony, has the Precision Cabernet at $12.99, which is something that we wanted to talk about as well. The remaining brands on the left are most of the larger brands produced in Napa. These are all Napa Valley appellated wine programs. So Robert Mondavi produces 100,000 cases of their Napa Valley appellated wine approximately. They obviously produce half a dozen other Cabernets. So these numbers are a little bit on the low side per producer, but we're just looking at their largest wine in Cabernet. In total, these top 22 brands produce 1.2 million cases approximately annually. What's interesting is their average bottle price is only $47 a bottle, which is well below what you would expect based on where Napa prices were in 2018, 2019, which is the vintages that are these wine volumes come from. That leaves another 1.6 million cases of wine produced from other people's brands that are not shown here. In order for those other 1.6 million cases to be to bring the Napa Valley average up to that same 1% or $79 a bottle, those other 1.6 would have had to have sold for $103 a bottle, which I'm betting that they didn't. The point of this is that there is a significant amount of value leakage if you think that 1% is the right economic metric for valuing grapes, for valuing, for selling grapes, for selling and valuing vineyards. There is some economic leakage that's going out of here, and it appears that it's probably on the winery side, which begs the question, our wineries taking on too much risk, and our growers going to be encouraged or pushed by the market to lower prices? I don't think we have an answer to that, but if you look at the data that Tony presented, as well as some of the data we're looking at, it does seem like it might be difficult for Napa to immediately return to those kind of $8,000 a ton levels.
So what is the best way to value wineries and vineyards? And IWA gets very involved in doing this as part of every project that we get involved with. And basically on the winery side, it's financial metrics, which are the underlying value of the business. It's similar to pricing a stock in the stock market, price earnings, or a multiple of earnings, and the discounted cash flow, present day value of future cash flow, future cash flow. That's the fundamental ways that we value the business, but also the asset values, which sometimes can be higher than the financial metrics, and that's of course common with large real estate assets too. Surprisingly, to many people in the Napa Valley, the asset value is the most common basis on which wineries actually transact. For vineyards, predominantly also based on the financial metrics. What are the farming returns? There can be some exceptions for sales of vineyards by wineries where the fruit is 100% used by the winery. Also, we look at comparative sales, the AVA, the same AVA or the general area. Typically, we value businesses and we value vineyards for market sales, which can be quite different from the way perhaps that Tony might look at appraising of the value of a business or a vineyard. Not that anything wrong with either way. It's just we are engaged to sell a business, and therefore, as such, we've got to give some sense of expectation to the seller as to what the value of the vineyard or the business can achieve in a transaction. So I think that the financial metrics can vary hugely in our business, and I think that institutional investors would be seeking a 8% farming return, whereas a winery that is taking in the fruit to produce and then sell in a bottle of wine may accept a very different kind of return, much lower, 2 to 3%. So I think that there's a number of different ways of looking at valuing wineries and vineyards, and it's a fairly nuanced science. I think it's very difficult to be very specific, but I think that it's got a lot to do with where the market is and what prices people are prepared to pay on the buy side. Next slide, thank you. So looking at vineyard values in the Napa Valley, Josh and I and our colleagues, we think about where vineyard values are potentially going to go in the Napa Valley. And we've always said, well, let's look and see at where we compare with perhaps some of the Grand Cru properties in Bordeaux, the great Cabernet properties on the left bank and the right bank, and see where we stand in terms of value per acre. Because in Bordeaux, some of the top properties have sold for very, very high prices per acre or per hectare, as they call it there. It's a useful benchmark to look at, but I think that we need to understand that the model that is used in Bordeaux, particularly the Chateau model, it entails a transaction when transactions do happen, and I might say that they are happening much less frequently in Bordeaux than they are happening in the Napa Valley these days, the past 10, 15 years. So that kind of a transaction in Bordeaux involves a winery, the vineyard, the inventory, case goods, library, and wine in barrels, and the brand name and the IP. and sometimes, often, a very large and substantial old chateau, the house. And typically that total value is then divided by the gross vineyard acres. So that sometimes on a comparative basis indicates that perhaps Napa doesn't necessarily have quite as far to go in terms of catching up with Bordeaux as we might think. But I think considering the data from some of the winery sales that we showed previously in this presentation, so the column on the right shows the total purchase price, the transaction value. So in the case of, let's say, Stony Hill, which transacted just again in January of this year, 34 acres planted at about a $20 million transaction value. So that gave a total transaction value of about $600,000 an acre. So that included the land, the winery, the permit, the library, a bottled wine, and also the wine in barrel. So you look down that list on the left side, and you see some pretty spectacular pricing per acre, if that's the way, if we do the same kind of comparison against the way they do it in Bordeaux. So Flora Springs, the Smith & Lafitte family, the Catillars, that was about a $50 million deal in Rutherford. A published number, I might say, because it was basically a real estate transaction. There was no intellectual property. The Flora Springs brand did not transact. No inventory, no library. So that worked out total transaction value divided by the total acres, about 800, almost 900,000 an acre. So this isn't the way that we generally look at it here in the Napa Valley when Tony is appraising a property, or we're valuing a property to sell. But I think it is interesting to look at it this way, and then look at Brand family or look at Colgan, and those numbers are pretty high. I mean, very high on a per acre basis. So I think that in certain cases there is some headspace for values in the Napa Valley long term for the top Cabernet estates to go up, to increase. But I think it's important to look at it this way, because we kind of get a view as to where we are, sort of compared against a great wine region like Bordeaux. Thank you. Next slide.
Yeah, just dovetailing off of that very point, when you look at Napa's 45,000 planted acres, of those in total, 30,000 acres are planted to Bordeaux varietals, including whites, which, if you sum up all of the top regions of Bordeaux, which are detailed here on the first point, those actually sum to 25,000 acres. So almost exactly the same amount of production coming out of the top portion of Bordeaux as coming out of Napa at this point, which does imply some sort of parity that we have achieved, at least in size. And as Robert showed on the previous slide, transaction values are already there. The concern that comes out of what we've seen, and we haven't really touched much on fire, I think Tony hit that pretty well, is that Napa needs to maintain its wine standing by protecting price as much as possible, whether it's grape price or whether it's bottle price. And a little bit of concern you hear, we're talking to people about the amount of Cabernet that's been planted at the south end of what has been typically the Cabernet belt, and even below Napa, creeping into Carneros. While global warming may prove those plantings to be risks that worth taking, at this point, it is a little concerning, as that Cabernet is going to be on the market and may end up in some cases at $12.99 at Costco. Just a quick comment on fire risks in general. We don't really believe that fire risks have been fully priced into the market. Obviously, last year was anomalous with the huge decrease in quantity as well as pricing. But we do feel like there is still some adjustment to be made in terms of what buyers are really willing to pay once they get, I was going to say comfortable. Comfortable isn't quite the right word with fires, but once they get adjusted to the fact that fires are going to be more prevalent, and as an industry, we need to learn how to deal with that and how to live with it economically. And I don't think the industry has figured that out yet. So that's probably the biggest thing along with water that we see in the near term, and unfortunately probably the longer term. Also worth noting that with the capital gains tax proposals on the table in Washington, we're looking at potentially over 50% capital gains tax for sellers of investment properties like vineyards and wineries, which, if that does kick in, will make it pretty daunting for some owners, particularly if they have a high debt level, to be able to sell their winery and vineyard assets. Last point, which is kind of counter to the thinking of a few years ago, whereas it was all about the value of vineyards planted on the hillsides, which were considered irreplaceable, considered only of increasing value, given what we've seen, particularly last year with the glass fire, and moreover, not so much with vineyards, but moreover with wineries, with the difficulty they're having in getting insurance for not only the buildings, but particularly for their barrels and wine in the barrels. We do feel like there may be some long-term shift in value from the hillsides back to the valley floor because there's just less fire risk there. So that's it. Any questions? Looks like we've got one.
Thank you.
All right, we do have one. So how do debt load and increase in capital gains relate to each other? Please give an example.
If that was a question related to the previous slide, it's really more answered by what a seller would need to achieve in order to pay off their debt and their tax burden. So take a $40 million transaction, for example. If that particular owner had, say, $20 million in debt and they had to pay $20 million in taxes, they would not realize any proceeds from that sale. Obviously, that's an oversimplified answer, but as debt load increases and capital gains increase, obviously, sellers are going to see less proceeds.
Wonderful. I'll give it a minute and I'll let a few more questions come in. I'll also launch our poll so that people can also answer that as well while we go through any final Q&As. And we can also bring Tony back on the screen if he wants to, if there's any questions for Robert, Josh, or Tony. We'll give it a second, see if any come in. That was wonderful information. So thank you guys very much for your time.
Of course.
Welcome.
Yes. And thank you all for answering the polls. 3 questions. What was your understanding before, after, and will you use this information?
Sorry, could you repeat that question, Emily?
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was the poll questions.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
right, sorry. Yeah.
Well, if there are no other open questions, we will be sending the recording of this webinar along with our speaker contact information and presentations early next week. And contact info for Robert and Josh will be provided. So we'll send that out. And thank you all for your time and expertise. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily.
We do have a question. Last minute. Are you ready? How likely do you think it is that the capital gains tax will go that high?
I'd be tempted to allow that one to Dr. Korea and let him answer that one. But I think my hope is that it's kind of like when you go to Napa County and you ask for an increase in your permit, you ask for 100,000 cases hoping to get 50,000 cases. My hope is that Biden's asking for 40% or 43%, I guess, capital gains tax, and will settle for less. Having a slim majority in Congress may prevent him from going as high as he wants to go. But we do see an impact, obviously, on that on transactions. However, we didn't get into 1031 tax deferred exchanges, which would prevent most sellers from paying income taxes on the sale of their real property, and that's probably the subject of an entire webinar unto itself. But a very useful tool that is still available.
But
Lovely.
it's under consideration though, too, by the Biden administration, seriously under consideration. But it's been
Okay.
a very helpful tool for us in transactions, actually.
Well, thank you all so much. And we will we'll end this webinar now, and we'll follow up via email when with recording. So thank you all.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Take care. Bye
Bye-bye.
now.